I am quite new to this SIG. I only joined a matter of months ago, just as lockdown happened, as these things often do. But just a bit of a brief introduction to SIG itself. You're probably more familiar with it than I am. So it's quite a broad church. We do cover all kinds of issues, from looking at 14 to 19-year-old vocational education through to informal education, post-compulsory education, and lifelong learning. My personal background is around lifelong learning, widening participation. Before I became a professor, I was in charge of foundation years, so I kind of have that kind of broad remit. So that's the kind of nature of SIG. I think there might be about 40 of you out there. A bit better. Great. So yeah, all I was doing was an introduction to the SIG, but if you just go to our thing, it will actually, if you go to our page, it will give you a bit of a background about what that is. The one thing I'd like to say is we'd just really like you to encourage any ideas that people have about events or publications they might want to have. Please just get in contact with me and Bill, because we want to, even in these strange times, try to have something that we'll all do together in terms of developing the SIG and interested, particularly anyone out there who isn't necessarily from traditional HEIs. So people are from colleges that do HEIs, let's talk. That would be great. Okay, hopefully that's enough about that. I was just going to hand over to Bill, who's going to introduce this particular event, and then he's going to hand back over to me, and I'll introduce the first symposium. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So, Aspiration and Constraint, we have a series of papers that were submitted to BERA conference and which have become, if anything, more timely as a result of events in recent months. We're really short of time, so it's going to be quite a quick fire session. We start with a symposium called Pathways to Success, a intersectional and spatial analysis of vocational education and training and vet mediated transitions. And there's going to be 4 papers, the first by Professor James Avis. Over to you, James.
Hello, everyone. As you can tell, I'm not particularly au fait with this sort of stuff. I'm about to try to share my screen with some difficulty, it turns out. Just give me one moment. Here we go. So we're getting there. Could someone tell me if you can see my screen?
Not yet.
No? You can. You can see my screen.
Not yet.
Oh, you can't. Not yet. So if I go in here, why are you up there, Bill? And I can't share my screen.
Do you want me to share mine?
You can do, if you can go to my my PowerPoints. That would be good.
Right. Okay, let's try that then.
Right, so I can't see anything yet, Bill.
Do you see the slides?
No, I can't see slides.
Not yet.
I can just to speak whilst we're trying to sort out this technical issue. I sent Bill an email earlier today saying that I was always nervous with technology, and I proved right. Anyway, so this little section is called COVID-19, Precarity, the Future of Work, Vet and Social Justice. And what I want to do is to touch on a number of issues, really to raise questions. But as an aside, one of the sadnesses I have with these sorts of presentation is that I can't see the audience, and it would be really nice to be able to see the audience. But what I want to do is to say something about the socioeconomic context within which the discussion is set, and by default, therefore, comment on the notion of interregnum and neoliberalism, say something about the labour market and COVID, touch on a thing that I always come back to, non-reformist reform, and then point to a number of questions that could inform subsequent discussion. Now, as you're all aware, the socioeconomic context of VET is subject to multiple challenges and conflicting analysis, which have been brought into stark relief by COVID. Now, I suspect, well, I know actually, that without, excellent Bill, could you put it on full screen? Can people see the slides now? So if you go on to slide 4 of your lot, the one, okay. So I suspect that without the pandemic, we would have been discussing Brexit, its impact on employment and the labour market, as well as the salience of the gig economy. All of which are themes currently addressed, that are currently addressed through the lens of COVID, although Brexit has made a somewhat belated return to discussion. Key questions remain about the long-term impact of COVID upon the economy, labour market and waged employment. Now, for a number of writers, it could be suggested that the pandemic has exacerbated and accelerated pre-existing trends towards flexible, remote working, with any number of consequences for the labour market. And I think there's an association here with arguments that address technological unemployment. But, avoiding a determinist line, I think it's important to acknowledge that employment structures are ultimately related to the outcome of our struggle. At the same time, it is suggested by a number of writers that those who argue that technical unemployment is occurring have exaggerated these claims. However, the discussion does raise questions about the availability of decent work and its distribution. The onset of digitalization and the development of artificial intelligence have resulted in the hollowing out of unskilled and mid-level routine wage labor, whilst simultaneously requiring high levels of skill amongst those in elite occupations. Undoubtedly, the nature of wage labor is changing. And if there is a commitment towards a socially just society, it raises the question about how VET should accommodate to the changing faces of wage labour. Developments that anticipated increasingly fluid occupational and labour market structures. However, we are yet to see the long-term consequences of COVID upon the labour market, VET and wider society. In a sense, we're placed within an interregnum in which the old is dying and the new cannot be born. The erstwhile of hegemony of neoliberalism has been debunked. The tenets upon which it is built have been shown to be fallacious. The claims to the superiority of the market, the furtherance of competition across all facets of social life, the privatization of the utilities and part of the welfare state have all been shown to exacerbate inequality. To the extent that neoliberalism was hegemonic, it is in the form of a post-neoliberalism that is characterized by a deep-set cynicism founded upon low trust, the pursuit of elites to secure their own interests, and a rampant capitalism marked by the decoupling of employment and wages from productivity and growth. This disconnect is reflected in a culture in which senior managers feel empowered to pay themselves large bonuses, even though their companies are failing or underperforming. Perhaps the best example of the failings of neoliberalism can be seen in finance capitalism, the mobilization of algorithms and the use of money to make money. Certainly in the early stages of COVID-19, the rapid ups and downs of the World Stock Exchange enabled finance capitalists to gain easy profits. The current COVID-19 crisis draws our attention to the inadequacies of all forms of neoliberalism. Yet it is important not to reify COVID-19 and to attribute to it an undeserved determinism. The way in which the current crisis surrounding the pandemic plays out will be the outcome of struggle. Currently, the credo of austerity, tenets of neoliberalism have been pushed to one side, being replaced by an interventionist state seeking to secure the long-term interests of capital. a state that mirrors a form of one-nation conservatism in which we are all constructed as part of the same community despite our differences. However, it's important to acknowledge that the parameters of what constitutes community is both imaginary and contested. We could, for example, conceive of a post-capitalist state which would question the inclusiveness of one-nation conservatism with its authoritarian underpinnings. Simultaneously, the importance of the welfare state and the nursing and social care workforce for societal well-being is being forcibly brought to our attention in the current crisis. That is to say, the work of those who labour as care workers, refuse collectors, and of course those working in the NHS. Care workers in particularly, who have previously been disparaged and offered low wages, are now recast as heroes, engaged in what may be described as really useful labour. These carers may be waged and, importantly, are often unwaged. We need only think of the contribution of voluntary worker whose practice could be seen to prefigure a transformation of social and economic relations towards a more caring society, and of course issues around gender. The current crisis points towards a contrast between what could be described as really useful labour set against the really useless labour of those involved in finance capitalism and various forms of management. There are other tensions and contradictions surrounding the current social and economic relations, not least the relatively secure incomes of senior managers set against the wage cuts and redundancies faced by low-wage manual workers, and the logic of capitalism in its pursuit of accumulation. Prior to the spread of COVID-19, the focus of this paper would have been on the significance of the gig economy for that, as well as the salience of digitalization and the logic of capital towards the expulsion of labor from production. The logic, however, or this logic, could be and can be moderated by economic calculation. If the cost of replacing labor by machinery was greater than the cost of low-waged workers, the latter would remain in place. These processes are set within a context marked by the hollowing out of the labour market and the automation of routine manual and non-manual labour tasks. At the same time, the significance of and need for, in inverted commas, highly skilled elite technical professionals and managerial workers coexist alongside the displacement of labour. To the extent that these notions describe what was the then current context, this was one derived from the balance of power between labour and capital, in which capital has been dominant. In such a context, VECT is to address the high skills level required by elite technical professional and managerial workers, as well as the putative development of a flexible, adaptable labour force suited to the gig service economy, which counters periods of under and unemployment. However, if we mobilise an expansive notion of labour and class that acknowledges not only the work of the waged, but also that of the unwaged, under and overemployed, as well as those who have been expelled from the formal economy, the workless, the disemployed. So how does all of this sit with COVID-19? The current conjuncture draws our attention to the profiteering of particular sections of capital, but also alerts us to the importance of nursing and social care workforce. We should include within this workforce those who are placed outside the wage nexus. How then should VET respond to the needs of this workforce? In addition, COVID-19 serves to remind us of the corporate responsibilities organizations have to wider society. Much the same can be said about the responsibilities of occupations and professions to wider society and the manner in which these ethical concerns can be aligned with VET. Importantly, these ethical responsibilities are subject to ongoing dialogue and development. VET needs to move beyond the form of expansive learning that Unwin and Fuller proposed to one that would enable a fully fledged critique of capitalism. However, this critique would not be subject to the assertion of a dogmatic diktat, but rather on the basis of dialogue and discussion. It's important, however, to acknowledge that education in general, and VET in particular, this is the third slide, the Allman quote. As Ullman and colleagues remind us, that is capitalist education, with practitioners and participants often struggling to relate it to wider social relations and seeking to provide a dialogic engagement with really useful knowledge. Gig workers, the intermittently employed who employed in shifting patterns of employment, raise a number of thorny questions for that, perhaps in the context of COVID, in which the state has pushed to one side fiscal constraint and the significance of that, and education generally as a right for all could be reasserted. Much the same point could be made in relation to those who have been expelled from the workforce and find themselves located in the informal economy, the workless, the disemployed. All of this raises the question of what does it mean to be a vocationally educated member of society, which in turn returns us to that and its responsibilities to wider society. We could envisage a number of scenarios post-COVID, which themselves would become sites of struggle. The fear is that a new form of austerity would be put in place that validates STEM, marginalizes the social sciences, and mobilizes the language of sacrifice to re-establish the economy in a form that mirrors its predecessor with all tensions, contradictions, and inequalities. In other words, the reformation of a post-neoliberal economy. Importantly, many of these issues I've discussed can't be resolved by education alone and necessitate the development of a non-reformist politics in the pursuit of a socially just society, the kind argued for by writers such as Fraser and Gortz, who comment, this is the fourth slide, yet struggle for non-reformist reforms can be questioned by post-neoliberalism, whilst the technologies surrounding the fourth IR could be mobilized in the pursuit of a socially just society. They are deeply constrained by their embeddedness in capitalist relations. Fraser and Jager write, the fifth slide, and that's me done. I mean, I've got a list of issues that I think what I've touched upon have raised, and I've got some references if you are interested in following up some of the ideas I've been talking about. I think I've done reasonably well in terms of time. Have I, Bill? This is where you can say no.
Reasonable.
You have indeed. We'll plan to take questions at the end. So I was going to now hand over to John. Are you out there, John?
I'm here, Bill. I'm ready to start. So, yeah.
Right. Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'll just talk. So my paper is called VET and Learning Entities in Factories of the Future. And it comes from a project I've been co-I on for the last 3 years with a lot of scientists. Myself and Rhiannon Firth are the only sociologists on this project. And the project looks at, it's speculative to say, what will factories of the future look like in 2030? And like all futurology, you know, it probably won't predict exactly what's happening. We didn't take into account, for example, that COVID was going to occur. But it looks at some tendencies. So we've done some observations and interviews in factories. One large manufacturer in the UK, workers cooperative who make robots in the US. We've also looked at skill shares and advanced robotic and AI laboratories producing stuff for manufacturers. And it's all about tendencies, but to me, really, the key point is sort of an experiential one, in that my dad worked at Rolls-Royce factory all his life, doing the same job, making airplane blades for jet engines and measuring them. And I got a chance to have an apprenticeship there when I was 15. I went around there, and the smell and the taste of a factory is still the same, and it's kind of still capitalism at the end of the day. You'd still recognize factory processes if you were, you know, a 19th century factory worker going into a robot factory today. There's still people doing the same things under the same sort of conditions. But what I want to say is we really found three things from our empirical work, and I'm going to sum them up in this way. The first one is what I call youth sovereignty or Pixarification. I'll explain that. The second one is return to competence and how competence is being welded into machine learning. And the third one is in terms of AI and skills clouds. So to start with then, the whole idea of what we call the chatty factory for the factory of the future is that products will have kind of human-like capabilities. So they've got sensors to sense their environment, they can record the nature of their use, and they can communicate back to the manufacturer directly. And this is already happening. So firms like Airbus have sensors in their airplanes already, and they can feed that back to the factory. And this is a real change in the paradigm of production. So early factory production, of course, was tailorist. You know, it was the same product. It was producer sovereignty, and workers were trained for one type of work. They were kind of preloaded with the skills that they had. The only need for additional training really was to cope with the boredom and monotony of work, which is why Ford set up their sociological department to study the working environment. Then we had to move to consumer sovereignty, which is post-Fordist production, which was to do with satisfying consumers. We had Toyotism with skilled workers in team working, but it was still relied on processes similar to scientific management in terms of monitoring what people were doing. And in both Taylorist and post-Fordist production, learning was located at the level of the human, and workplace learning was based on this idea of a external vantage point. So scientific experts or human relations experts, depending upon which paradigm you're in, could have gone into the factory and observed things and made things better, meaning more productive and more efficient and more profitable. So in the chatty factory, you've got this new model of sovereignty, which I call use sovereignty, where the use of a product determines its own production. So we've got all these advances in AI and machine learning, so products can model human senses. So when I'm using my iPhone, the iPhone's actually feeding back to Apple about how I'm using it. So it's calibrating the sort of apps I use, how I'm holding it, how hard I'm even pressing some of the stuff, you know. So it's all being fed back. So products are becoming chatty. They're feeding back to the factory. So you've got a change really to use sovereignty. So it's the use of products then that are then determining their own production. So it's kind of like an advanced form of obviously commodity fetishism. But in terms of workplace learning, it's really interesting because the focus of learning is now the commodity, not the people who make it. So how the commodity learns outside the workplace, how it communicates this learning to other entities, has become the major part of what learning is about in Factories of the Future. So capitalism not only appears, as Marx said, to be a mass of commodities to highlight the ephemeral nature of the form of value, but this mass of commodities becomes determinant in its own production, apparently, seemingly, removing human agency from the process. So it's an expansion of commodity fetishism. So that's the first thing. The second thing is about competence. So I've written about competence before, and competence-based learning is solely concerned with the performance or the outcome. It's not concerned with any kind of internal processes at all. So in this paper, I talk about the idea of a competency ghost. So the things that workers are doing in factories might as well be done by ghosts because there's no real emphasis on any kind of internal process. Competence isn't nonsense. I mean, this idea of a competence ghost makes perfect sense in a capitalist economy where capitalists can take ownership of any skills workers have and just specify what they want them to do. So competence is great in terms of how it seeks with other types of learning like machine learning and AI and robotics. So machine learning is a collective name for a series of techniques that involve statistical processes, and these processes aren't really learning either. They're just predicting what will happen in the environment. So competence and machine learning have become tied together. So I've just got a couple of minutes left. So that's the second thing. The third tendency is about AI and skills clouds. So it's now possible, if you've read Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism, she talks about this idea of a behavioural surplus. So contemporary capitalism is not just about measuring what people do now, like the quantified self, like Phoebe Moore has talked about, but actually kind of creaming off a behavioural model of what people do. And there's been attempts now to develop skills cloud. So Workday, which is a NASDAQ listed company with a market capitalization of 40 billion, has produced a skills cloud system that uses machine learning to categorize skills between organizations to form a common skills language or grammar of skills. So there's these three tendencies really we found through the project. So the whole workplace is consistently learning and transformed into workplace learning, where every interaction by any entity is transformed into a learning relationship. In many ways, the solidity is being diffused into air of learning. And in many ways, this is a crisis for the relationship between learning and the workplace, because the traditional humanist basis of learning is being destroyed. Now, one way to go for this might be in terms of post-humanism, object-orientated ontologies, to network theory. I argue in this paper they're flat ontologies. They privileges flatness. They don't explain subsumption. They don't explain the flattening into social forms, which value critique and Marxist analysis tend to do. And also in the conclusion, I talk about alternatives outside or congruent with contemporary capitalism, but maybe prefigurative of another form. So workers' cooperatives, skill shares cooperatives, we might see these occurring with COVID. We might see resistances, gaming of these algorithms in a kind of COVID environment. What we have at the moment, I think, is that workers, you know, can just walk into factories, walk into Amazon logistics without skills, and just be used, as Mark said in the Grundrisse, as the human components. So we've got a system where everything's learning in factories of the future, in industry and of 4.0, everyone except for the workers. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And again, thank you, James, before you. All good food for thought. I would remind people, if you've got questions, just put them in the Slido and we'll try and come back to them if we can. Just to speed up time, I'm not going to give a detailed introduction to people because you've probably noticed I haven't. I was going to suggest if you can just give, if you want to find out people's background, if you go on our website for the events, we give quite a comprehensive view of people. But so with that in mind, are you ready for us, Charlotte?
I am, yes. Can you hear
Brilliant.
me there? Yeah.
We can indeed, so I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. So give me 1 second and this should come up. And then... So I'm going to, my focus today will be a longitudinal empirical project, which was based on school-based careers work, and it's got significant implications for post-COVID education, as well as picking up on some of the themes that James and John have already talked about. And it's called Learning to Labour as Gendered, Class and Race Females. So, careers work in schools in England includes a wide range of support activities, and since 2011, careers work for young people has been provided by the schools without the support of a discrete career support service. The Department for Education has provided schools with guidelines to help them deliver careers work, but these remain quite vague. There's an assumption in the guidelines that career guidance will contribute to upward social mobility and challenge pupils' stereotypes. And it's these stereotypes which are assumed to be what's preventing students from aspiring to and accessing higher status or higher paid jobs. Now, there's little empirical research on schools' implementation of these government guidelines with regards to the reproduction of social inequalities. Whereas the reproduction of privilege and disadvantage in schools in general is well documented, what's less well understood is how targeted careers work feeds into the reproduction of privilege and disadvantage. Now, this study focuses on working class minority ethnic females at a single inner city secondary school. Now, we know already from other research that the labour market in the UK is highly gendered and raced. The impact of discrimination and austerity measures, particularly on working class and minority ethnic women, is also well documented. We also know that girls continue to aspire to traditionally feminized occupations, and working class women in particular frequently see their roles as quite traditional and aspire to care and catering or administrative work. There's a debate around where careers aspirations come from, but there's little work which actually connects targeted careers work in school with young people's aspirations, and that's what I'm doing here. The approach I use in the paper to analyse this is a Marxist feminist approach, where I draw on the work of British and Canadian Marxist feminist scholars such as Colley, Banerjee and Mojab. Now, they've used this framework to analyse vocational and adult education, and I'm taking it to look at careers work. It seems to be still very relevant, and a key point about their work is that the stratification of the labour market is inherent to capitalism and indeed constitutive to capitalism. And what's important for them is that race, class and gender intersect to create a structure which disadvantages women, and particularly Black and minority ethnic women. So there's three intersecting aspects to the analysis here: working class pedagogies, gendered pedagogies and race pedagogies. And very briefly, these scholars have argued that working class pedagogies, the way in which they are manifest currently, is that the training for the labour market for working class young people requires this focus on the development of skills and competencies. And actually, John Preston has just mentioned something similar here. So the idea is to make oneself employable, to make oneself work ready, and there's this focus on self-management. So a doing rather than a knowing that doesn't involve a critical approach to understanding the world of work or one's position within it. And these have been criticised as training for exploitation. And the idea is, in fact, to inculcate attitudes consistent with low pay and low status schools in work in young people. And gendered pedagogy, so scholars such as Colley have shown how vocational courses socialise young women into caring roles. These processes of training ensure that working class girls actually end up aspiring to these jobs. So they create the aspirations. And similarly, in race pedagogies, it's long been argued that minority ethnic young people in England have been steered towards vocational provision, which is unlikely to provide them with a secure, well-paid position in the labour market. And in particular, research has mostly focused on males, but where it's focused on females in particular as well, I'm thinking of the work of Heidi Mercer a generation ago. Her work showed how minority ethnic women have been steered again towards care and service work. So I'm going to focus on, very quickly, three areas in the study. So there's just a little bit of background to the study. It's a longitudinal study from 2014 to 19, so obviously before COVID. It was funded by the Aldgate and All Hallows Foundation. It involved qualitative research with 18 students and members of staff. The pupils were all female, of minority ethnic heritage and working class, and what we refer to as middle achievers. So the three findings, about the careers programme. Sorry, just there we go. Labour market skills. As far as labour market skills were concerned in their careers programme at school, there was mostly a focus on skills and competencies. So in fact, no activities involve gaining a wider understanding of the labour market or connections, particularly between subjects and job roles. And for example, here I've got a couple of quotes from the scheme that they were involved in, which was a business mentoring scheme. Now, the interviewees saw this as quite positive, but again, it didn't involve a critical understanding of the labour market or their position within it. So it's about putting a CV together, doing presentations, writing interviews. As far as further study was concerned, most of the people in the study didn't get the chance to visit universities. So there were visits, but they were only to the most elite universities, mostly Oxford and Cambridge, and there were no visits to lower tariff universities. So those would be the type of universities, in fact, that working class minority ethnic students would be most likely to attend. And they were only for what was referred to as the gifted and talented students, which tend to be those who are higher attainers, but they're also those who are mostly middle class rather than working class. So in fact, no university visits then for working class pupils who simply weren't being given a chance to visit a university before taking that decision. And then thirdly, what they learnt about the labour market positions that they might be expected to go into. So again, what's interesting here is this is very similar to research conducted a generation or more ago by people like Heidi Mirza and Hazel Carby. And in this study, both careers interviews and work experience placements were encouraging these students into jobs which are stereotypically occupied by working class minority ethnic females. So such as administrative work or care work. And then briefly, to finish with, I'm just going to discuss the impact on young people's aspirations after taking part in this 5-year careers programme. So, firstly, the majority of them, when they started the project with me, they were aspiring to higher occupational classes, doctor, engineer, journalist, and teacher. But by the time we finished the project and by the time they'd finished their careers programme at school, they were aspiring to lower occupational classes, more like nursery nurse and administrator. And in fact, those were reflected, like their aspirations were reflecting more and more the careers programme itself. There was also a move towards more gendered roles, such as midwife and primary school teacher as well. And the other important point was that by the time we finished the project, when they were asked about their aspirations, they talked about helping others. So everybody, whether they wanted to be a policewoman or a nursery nurse or a solicitor even, they said the reason they wanted to do that job was because it would allow them to help others. And again, that really reflects the focus of the careers programme. It also obviously reflects the idea that perhaps they thought their early aspirations were unrealistic, perhaps they saw them as unobtainable, and also they may be engaging in a kind of strategic careers approach, so that these traditional roles might certainly represent some kind of social mobility for them, as well as a rationalising of opportunities. But what's also important is that they were reflecting the school careers programme. So the school careers programme was actually preparing them for these traditional raced, gendered and stereotyped roles. And this is interesting now in the light of COVID, as we see the status perhaps of these occupations may change, as James Avis talked about. What will that mean for the status of this population group? What will it mean for the stratification of the labour market in race, gendered and class terms? How will careers education change in response to COVID? And that's me done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlotte. There are a couple of questions that have come up for you in the chat, but I think given time, because we're meant to finish in about 4 minutes, I will make sure that they come back to you and give you a chance to respond afterwards.
Okay.
So the last one we've got, Bill. Technically, you've got 4 minutes, but I think if you could maybe get it down to sort of 6 or 7, that would be great.
Thank you, Mike. Let me crack on. But let me begin by linking a little bit from what my colleagues have already said to remind you of the purpose of this workshop. We've seen this around the gap between the aspirations of young people, of their teachers, of people who are interested in the development of VET, and the constraints that they encounter because of the reproductive forces of capitalism, essentially. And as we've moved from James's contribution through to Charlotte's and to mine, we're focusing less on the context and more on the way those aspirations play out. And let me begin by saying that we often talk in rather abstract terms about the role of vocational education in social reproduction. Of course, society is much more complex. Production is much more complex than in the days of capital, or the days of Braverman and people who've written about the tendency for de-skilling, or indeed of skill polarization. We've got a much more complex society. But that doesn't mean that the forces of reproduction and the ways that people are forced into reproducing the class roles that contemporary modes of production need is in any way diminished. Those are still really powerful forces that play out through contemporary policies and practices in VET. And the study that this paper's about, and the studies linked to it, are essentially about the way that we've seen a stratification within further education in England open up. There's always been a distinction between different levels, different courses, preparing people for different roles in society. Our contention is that the greater emphasis on learning in the workplace has strengthened this enormously. And there's quite a simple reason for that, which is that if you imagine that education is geared towards the norms of general education, of higher education, of preparing people for academic routes or rejecting them, and if workplace training is simply reduced to preparing people in narrow and instrumental ways for their job roles, then that implies that the learning that takes place in work will be of a particularly narrow and limited type compared to in countries or under systems where learning in school or college is seen as closely related to and interacting with learning in the workplace. And so what we've seen in contemporary policy changes in England, the apprenticeship standards, the T levels and the work placements for T levels in particular, is an emphasis on learning at work, not as part of the general development of young people and to support their transitions to employment and to adulthood and taking part in all of society's functions, but its reduction to preparing them simply for occupational roles. And for that reason, we started to identify the very different ways that young people in more relatively privileged roles, I hasten to say, differs increasingly from the way that people with who have lower levels of education attainment are being prepared for low skill, so-called low paid precarious employment. Now, since we submitted our paper, we've seen some changes in terms of the COVID pandemic, the recovery packages and the particular narrow way that they're being posed, but also some of the other opportunities that are opening up at the higher end for young people. We've seen some evidence of the same kind of stratification across European and North American systems. And it's become more and more clear to us that some of the concepts that have been used to explain the differences in different forms of VET in different countries have lost some of their explanatory value, because there's a movement in a direction of neoliberal policies in all countries. And what we find more valuable than some of those concepts, and I'm thinking particularly about notions of different forms of welfare, is the idea that there is a dualization between the way that young people from the more advantaged strata of the working class have been incentivized to prepare themselves for skilled roles, and the way that other people are being prepared to move into low value roles. And there's evidence that there's a certain lag between processes that began in the sphere of production as early as the 1980s and have then found their way into welfare policies and are now playing out in very stark terms in VET. Think about the way that the growing inequalities of the workplace have developed. I can't talk through all these pictures, but some of you will be aware that these are images of short cycle production, of more humanized forms of employment, and the way that we've moved back towards production lines, towards higher levels of automation that John was talking about, and the kind of pervasive business improvement techniques that are standardizing people's roles both in manufacturing and service industries. And what's taking place in VET is the transfer, particularly in England, of learning into the domain of production, so that we see those differences playing out in VET as well. I don't have time to talk through all the slides now, but particularly in the most recent study that the paper's based around, we see a distinction between those people who are in what we've characterized as welfare VET. These people who, we might say, are providing welfare, often in care roles, for example, but are in many ways the recipients of welfare as it's constituted in the most liberalized countries, the most marginal forms of employment, and their learning emptied out into routinized socialization. There's some of the quotations from their experiences. On the other side, we have those people who are being prepared for what we've described as technical elites, young people who are being prepared for usually male roles, construction, and particularly professional construction, engineering. We carried out a study at a centre where they've got a particularly strong model of working intimately with employers to meet their needs. One of the things that we found most interesting about this study actually was that this route, which purportedly offers different kinds of learning experience, in many ways does provide more rich opportunities for learning at work, is nevertheless making claims to provide a superior form of VET with reference to the norms of higher education, which have a tendency to disadvantage the experiences of young people in vocational settings. And you see some of this in some of the data where people talk about the way that they're encouraged now do dissertations, to engage in theorized learning, and yet it's at a distance from the concrete experiences and the application of concepts, or the iterative process between theory and practice that might be evident. So whilst our original paper drew out some conclusions about the way those early experiences of work operated in effect, and the different forms of socialization that were in evidence, rather than any practical preparation for advanced employment or citizenship, some of those developments we can see now in the post-COVID period open up a whole range of different ways of thinking about that. The possibility that those developments can be, that differentiation can be deepened across more spheres, but also some of the ways that it might be a challenge that James talked about at the start. So let me depart and stop sharing at that point.
Thank you again, Bill. I'm going to suggest unfortunately, and that's a fascinating panel we've had across everybody, but we haven't got time for questions, but a number of questions have been put in the chat. So if the authors can just have a look and maybe do some response, we'll make sure they get to people. So there might be a bit of a virtual debate going on, but we will have to move on, and we probably again have time for the 2 presentations and not questions at the end. So if people can put in questions as we go along, we'll try and have 2 debates going on.
And Mike, can I just say, we're going to carry on this discussion in the Bearer blog as well. Right. So some of these points can get picked up there.
Yep.
As we have that discussion.
Brilliant. So yes, it won't all disappear. So we'll have time here, but time again. So Christina, I'm sure if people want to know Christina's background, people can look it up, and I'm sure you can introduce your topic yourself. Got 10 minutes. If that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you, Christina.
Okay. So good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me at the seminar today. I think given the provocation provided by the title of this event today, I felt moved to try and use my time with you to attempt to conceptualize the challenges of building trust in very uncertain times. The last 6 months have been particularly interesting for someone who has an interest in trust dynamics. Trust in government is at an all-time low, and interpersonal relations are more fractured than they ever have been, as we struggle to know how to live alongside each other during this crisis. Trust is something that needs stability to thrive, what Somka refers to as normative coherence, societies which are stable enough to allow an individual to reasonably predict the behaviour of another. So the closer we are to existential security, the easier it is to place faith in other people. And it's this ability to safely predict the behaviour of another, even in total strangers, that makes trust a necessarily shared endeavour. However, in a society where so many of our actions are predicated upon self-interest, it is an endeavour which becomes increasingly difficult. And for me, the study of trust and distrust allows us to address the emotional impact that political structures have in our lives, and offers us a lens for framing our response to uncertainty. So the context of this presentation is grounded in the findings of my PhD study, which aim to establish how trust relations are constructed within the modern FE institution, and to determine to what extent this is shaped by the external environment. But this morning, I intend to discuss how the stories that emerged from this study might be used to help us think about and work towards institutional trust cultures. So let me begin with a story, and I'll read it out to you if I may. In an environment where distrust dominates, the individual is forced to secure a sense of safety using self-preservation strategies as they struggle to mitigate their own feelings of powerlessness. Their lives tend to evolve around some sort of trouble. This trouble appears to have a defining impact upon their disposition towards self and others. As such, they approach others with some degree of trepidation. They cannot exclude the possibility that others may cause them harm. The degree of caution and sometimes suspicion with which they approach their environment fuels their survival instincts as they perceive threat to be ever present and the struggle ongoing. They are prepared for confrontation at any given moment, and relations with others are often characterized by conflict, tension, or unease. And sometimes this conflict can take the form of resistance. This resistance is often in reaction to feelings of oppression, and these conflicts are sometimes injurious, leading to a reinforced negative conceptualization of self or a sense of hopelessness about a very uncertain future. Now, this story is a fiction. It's a trope which projects what distrust might look and feel like to an individual experiencing it. However, stories can also be truth-telling, or in the words of Arthur Frank, authentic fabrications, often speaking to a truth that the reality cannot quite convey as powerfully. So if you recognise all or part of this story, it's because it speaks to an essentialised experience of distrust. So you might think of your own story, the story of a place where you've worked, or the students that you've worked with, past or present. I wrote this story using the key findings of my thesis, a synthesis of 6 narrative typologies, which work to position the participants in my study towards others within the institution. Each of these narrative typologies that you see on the screen here perform. They work upon the storyteller to create their sense of self and their disposition towards the institution. They also interact with each other, and so engagement with one typology tends to lead to an engagement with others. For example, the typology of trouble, the presence of critical or past events that have influenced the storyteller's present position, has a relationship with the presence of struggle, where storyteller's relationship to others is characterized by conflict. Similarly, the lack of stability that the typology of struggle creates can lead to narratives of uncertainty, where the storyteller struggles to articulate the future. And the ability to reasonably predict the future is strongly associated with the ability to trust or distrust. As 600,000 students, young people, graduate into the labour market this year, the Learning and Work Institute have warned that there is a risk of a pandemic generation emerging, as NEET cases are set to rise by 20% in the next year. The scarring effect could be significant, as the long-term impact of recession stilts opportunities for young people, particularly those from marginalised communities, who are disproportionately represented on entry-level courses in FE. We are challenged to interrogate the mechanisms which reproduce labour market marginality or even redundance, according to class, race and gender. And without doubt, the pandemic has brought the problems of an advanced capitalist economy into sharp focus. A society built upon competitive self-interest makes the uncertainty presented by the threat of COVID-19 all the more difficult to navigate, as individuals have to take painful decisions over whether to protect their community or their financial stability. And this raises important questions for a sector whose issues operating within a neoliberal marketplace are well documented. While the time allotted for this presentation does not allow me to go into detail, I have made the case elsewhere that the precarity coupled with ongoing policy turbulence keeps conditions ripe for uncertainty in a sector that appears perpetually on the edge of crisis. This reduces room for manoeuvre in creating safe and stable conditions within which institutions can support students through times of crisis. Zomke contends that if trust engenders security and the ability to take risks, then distrust can only represent the opposite. For him, distrust can only lead to what he calls social paralysis, an inevitable isolation from others. And when we struggle to place faith in those around us, we can retreat into ourselves and withdraw, the consequences of which can be profound. So it's important to consider then the factors that influence our decision to place faith in others. When we take the decision to trust, we are essentially asking ourselves 3 key questions about the other party. Are they benevolent? Do they have our best interests at heart? Are they competent? Do they have the ability to uphold those things with which I've been asked to trust them? And do they have integrity? Are they honest about their intentions towards me? Guido Muellering describes trust as a leap of faith, a quasi-religious experience in which the individual necessarily has to suspend doubt in order to act as if the future is certain. This is importantly different from a categorical desire for certainty. Taking the leap of faith means that conditions must be in place which allow individuals to be vulnerable and to take risks, which lies at the core of our ability to trust. Trust is therefore a positive action and can only happen in situations where we can embrace our own vulnerability. For students and staff in my research, the capacity to trust had 4 key components. These are thriving, unity, transformation, and optimism. Thriving was associated with a sense of existential safety afforded to individuals who perceive the world as helpful. Students and staff who were thriving spoke with a self-confidence which not only allowed them to feel competent, but also understand themselves as reliable and trustworthy. In other words, they understand their value to others in the wider community, which contributes to their sense of belonging in the educational context. Unity refers to a position in which individuals understand that they are part of an interdependent community. They position themselves in close affiliation with others around them and recognise the important contribution that other people make to their lives. Unity works to evoke the spirit of cooperation, respect, and honesty. It's associated with an assumed trustworthiness based on mutually shared values, and as such, other people are perceived as benevolent. Transformation is associated with destiny and fulfillment. Individuals associated with transformation are where they want to be in life and doing what they love the most. Not only is this associated with excitement and creativity, it coexists with a sense of agency and control over the future. The future is in their hands, which contributes to the creation of an authentic sense of self, knowing that they are becoming who they were always meant to be. These key optimism represents the forward-facing nature of trust, so placing faith in the benevolence of others allows storytellers to feel confident in planning their future. These key elements of trust do not operate in isolation. If we truly want to achieve transformation for our students, it must be rooted in high trust cultures, which can only be sustainable in a culture which is led by these values. So I'd like to finish by leaving you with some questions for the sector if we hope to build trust cultures and restore hope. Who determines culture and who writes our values? There is a greater need to interrogate the values that guide practices in the sector and to carefully consider the impact that neoliberal competition has upon this. Shaw argues that hope is generated in relationships based on mutuality and equity, where reciprocity challenges the dominant hierarchical norm. How can we create spaces for vulnerability? Feelings of isolation are born of a failure to create the conditions in which individuals can rehearse their authentic selves. And so creating space for vulnerability involves valuing the identities and the histories that people bring with them. How can we hold people's trust during times of crisis and give them hope for the future? Vicky Meaby's research with marginalised young people found that providing opportunities for individuals to restory their lives was a significant factor in restoring their sense of faith in the world around them. And I hope these concepts that I've discussed today serve as a starting point for reconceptualising what an FE institution could be. For me, this mandates us to move away from a valorisation of invulnerability towards cultures which embrace risk and foreground the courage it takes to be vulnerable. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Christina. Again, begs lots of questions. Trust is one of my areas I've done quite a bit of work on. We'll probably talk outside of here. But just to do fair to Lynn, I think, are you ready to come in now, Lynn?
I am indeed. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Let me just share my screen. Hopefully you're all going to be seeing that if I kick it off. And start my stopwatch as well. Fantastic. Good afternoon, just about everybody. When I put in a proposition to the BERA conference, I was hoping that it would be relevant, my research, but I'm thinking that the last 6 months, which feel like 6 years, have perhaps made it even more relevant. And what I'd like to talk to you about in the next 10 minutes is how FE practitioners use Twitter and other informal professional learning opportunities to explore their professional identity. I've put a little message in chat about how you can reply. So this is all about informal professional learning, and I've also called it More Than Ever, We Need to Talk About Twitter. And that's my handle if you'd like to follow and comment. The starting pistol for my thesis was some ETF staff individualised record research back from 2017 now, which was a little bit of a shockwave sent across the sector, that only 40% of FE teachers engaged in CPD. It's very problematic about what is CPD and what does engaged mean, but you know, our sector does love those headline percentages. So there was much debate on this, and further research was done. So my research highlights tensions in FE educators' CPD or professional learning. The same research done the following year, published in 2018 by the Education and Training Foundation, found that 38% of staff said that some of their mandatory training was tick box and it met the organisation's requirements but not theirs. And only about a third of them also said that some training had no value at all to them. interesting, I thought, that around 60% of respondents to that survey said they had their training needs met. So you've got this picture of mandatory compulsory CPD for further education and VET not really hitting the mark, but at the same time, Bergvik and et al. Are saying that practitioners' informal social media based professional learning dialogues are burgeoning, both in participation from educators, but also in academic interest. So that was something that spurred my interest to investigate this for my thesis. So I have put a little message in chat. So what do you think? So either in Q&A or via Twitter, please tag Beera News and use the hashtag. I'd be interested in people sharing some words on experiences with informal professional learning, and that can be online or off. So how would you describe your experiences with informal professional learning? And we'll hopefully return to that later, or as we've said in the blog too. My research questions, I completed my doctorate in April this year, which seems like about 6 years ago rather than a few months. I looked at how FE teachers' participation in online learning was considered meaningful. I also investigated whether their professional learning dialogues informally online would be regarded as important and to be key for stakeholders in the sector, so professional bodies and such. And also I examined whether FE teachers were reporting formally, was there any formal recognition of these informal online dialogues, or any sharing of the results and the impact with colleagues or their organisation. So how did I go about it? It was via an ethnographic analysis. I've put click-through links for all of the literature that I'm calling upon, so you can just click on those from the presentation. So I looked at 3 significant Twitter-based further education educators communities over a 6-month period. And I used a graphic mapping strategy to look at the dialogues. Now, because Twitter is, just micro blogging, so it's limited characters, and also Twitter will encourage people to use hashtags and it'll highlight keywords. Actually, low inference descriptors were not too much of a challenge compared to perhaps, how we might draw out the threads and the codes from a 1-hour interview. So it allowed me to put together this this graphical thematic analysis of the threads that were happening on the online informal communities, as I said, over that 6-month period. And I drew these together into what I'm calling the 3-lens model of educators' Twitter dialogues. So what I was seeing was that there was a pedagogy lens, so teachers were discussing what they do in evidence-informed practice. There's also a learning community lens, so how do teachers come together to connect, to share opportunities for growth and support each other to develop through key career stages and changes. But what was really surprising for me was the prevalence of what I call identity and voice dialogues. So these dialogues were all around teachers defining their values and advocating for them. So dialogues about further education, VET going beyond learning for earning, so learner emancipation, also encouragement for learners and teachers to take part in political activism aligned with their values. I made a link to Biesta's domains of educational purpose, so identity and voice mapping to subjectification, learning community mapping to socialization, and the pedagogy lens dialogues mapping to qualification. The one thing that did come through strongly was that these dialogues, these brief little micro blogs on Twitter, are a precursor, a springboard for informed praxis, but we might call them pre-praxis. So it's teachers finding their way in those 3 areas. After I'd formulated this 3-lens model, I took it into one-to-one interviews on informal online learning with teachers, support staff, with managers and leaders, and also with some of the moderators of the forums. And I presented these in my thesis in the form of fake tweets that seemed apposite. And I'm not going to read them out in full. I'm just going to draw out some of the key words and vocabulary because of having limited time. So a STEM teacher saying no appetite for trying new strategies in her organisation, the same conversations. So Twitter and other online networks allow teachers to turn outwards and have exposure to new ideas. A teacher educator says she feels she's the only person asking critical questions in her organisation, so she tries to link up online with others who do the same. Really evocative vocabulary. It's a desert out there, so we're lucky to be in an era where we can connect, and Twitter's brilliant at that. And an HE and FE teacher, again, very evocative. Work, I am only an island. It's only me in my office and job role. So how will I find out about new things? She talks about gatekeepers. I'm not senior enough for managers to pay me to go to a conference, and I'm not getting challenging conversations at work. I might if I went wider outside. So Twitter gives her that opportunity to network. Just as I'm asking you, I asked teachers to give me 10 words on informal online learning. And here's the word cloud that resulted. So some real key themes coming through there, that it's collegial, collaborative, supportive, it's engaging, but also political. Utopian, so it's not plain sailing, but it's peer-led and accessible. So it'd be interesting to find out what words you're using also to describe your experiences of informal learning. Key themes, and I think this has significant relevance, in 2020. I completed my Viva as Sunderland University's first Skype Viva because lockdown was just happening. So I'm hoping that these will resonate perhaps even more. A teacher said we're subverting the dominant CPD paradigm with informal learning. Educators exercise agency in direction. A very strong theme that came through was the erosion of staff room culture. So hot desking, fractional contracts, and now exacerbated by COVID and remote working, we've lost those staff room communities and all of those conversations. So Twitter allows challenging dialogues where we explore those three lenses, but importantly, it's talking about the teacher's role transcending what Biesta called, learning for earning. It's a foil to performative tick box CPD, but only a springboard to deeper, meaningful learning. And the important thing I think to highlight was that the majority of participants don't document their informal learning or pass it on in any structured way. So to wrap up, my key themes were that all this talk of effective, robust CPD in organisations, Caulfield said that overuse has rubbed those terms smooth of meaning. The rhizomatic networks, we're seeing an emergence of new dialogue forms. So it's against that traditional objective-based model of professional learning. And Cormier says here that on these online rhizomatic networks, after Deleuze, he's drawing on Deleuze in Guattari's work, that community is the curriculum. And finally, with the COVID message and all of the upheaval, we're seeing a challenge to dominant dialogue. So Bourdieu talks about what goes without saying, and he also suggests that we can see the universe of the undiscussed being overhauled, but in times of significant crisis. And we have Brexit, we have climate change, now we have COVID. And the optimistic message I want to end with is that we are seeing a lot of new platforms and dialogues. We've got the BCU Reimagine FE conference that's been going for several years now, and new communities, I've linked them there, such as Joy FE, which brings teachers together to co-create the future of FE via these rhizomatic online dialogues. So I'm hoping there to end with some optimism. Thank you for joining the discussion. I have to mention ETF, who sponsored my research, and also for Sunderland University for supporting me. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Lynn. Again, there's from both those presenters a whole lot of stimulating questions. And if you look in the chat, I think, Lynn, you've posted one yourself, which is great. So there is some chat and if people can come back, that would be great.
I will aim to respond to those in chat. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. I'd just like to hand over to Bill now, who should be able to lead us into the next seminar.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Colleagues, we're still 5 minutes behind as we move into the next symposium. So no introduction from me, because these colleagues can speak for themselves, and indeed because they're artists, you know, they can illustrate it too. So over to you, Sam, to begin with your symposium.
Can you hear me okay?
Can now.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sam Broadhead from Leeds Arts University, and I wanted to talk about access students and visual culture learning communities, and particularly how they've responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. So the aims of this presentation are to argue for an expanded understanding of why mature students, and in particular access students, choose to study art and design, and to explore the possibility of altruistic motivations for study. I also want to demonstrate how some access students, when they've achieved their degrees, set up visual culture learning communities. And this is a term discovered by Friedman in her research around online learning. I also want to consider how VCLCs have been responsive to the COVID-19 pandemic. So just a little bit of background. What are access to HE courses in the UK, for those people who don't know? There are really two types of access course. The one that I'm concerned with are the access to HE diplomas. They are mostly delivered in further education and regulated by the QAA. But there are also those access programs that are delivered in higher education, and often they're very much concerned with internal progression. Now, access courses are designed for what has been described as second chance students. Those students, for whatever reason, don't have the qualifications necessary to progress onto a degree program. And this might be for a lot of reasons. People may not have achieved when they were at school for social, cultural, economic, demographic, political, or even health reasons. So access courses are almost like a repair system, enabling them to fulfill their aspirations later on in life. So the research method, or the research this draws upon, is actually an extension of a longitudinal study that was done in 2011-2014, where mature students with an access background, after they've done their access course, what happened to them? And using narrative inquiry, we tracked these access students on their degrees. And when that project finished, we then looked to see what happened in 2019 to 2020. So it was like, with narrative inquiry, in a way, the story never ends. And it was a way of seeing what were the implications of these people's education. So we're going to look at 3 case studies. We're going to look at Jake, and he set up a visual culture learning community called Art School Ilkley. Then there was Eliza, who set up a visual culture learning community called So for Change. And finally, we look at Karen, who was part of a group of 5 artists, all mature students, and they were called the TCL, the Art Collective. So what are visual culture learning communities? So Friedman did a lot of research looking at online communities created by young people. And she argued that these online communities came about because it was recognised there were gaps in formal arts education. Many people seek to learn outside schools, outside universities, in museums, community centres, or outside institutions altogether. And digital learning is a way of creating another safe space for young people, in this case, to learn about a lot of diverse practices. Things like cosplay, tattoo art, anime designs, character development, comic books, zines. These were all practices that weren't being represented in the kind of formal education of art and design. And these visual cultural learning communities were informal, and they allowed a safe space for critical review, for dissemination and exhibition. And I'm proposing that it's not just young people that set up these learning communities. So it's been well documented that there are many motivations for people to undertake access courses and then go on to study on degrees. And a lot of it is very much about the individual, better employment in the future, setting up one's own business, personal development, life satisfaction, love of the subject, being with like-minded people. However, Ray and Maguire and McGivney have all hinted that actually there are other motivations as well to do with active citizenship, giving back to society, to help other people, even this idea of altruism. And these learning communities, visual cultural learning communities, are often a way that people can help others, other people who want to learn creative skills, who want to be part of a creative community. So if we briefly look at 3 of the case studies, Eliza was in her 50s when she did her access course. She then went on to do a degree in textiles and then postgraduate study. She set up her Sew for Change project, which was about using sewing as a means of storytelling and working with people. She taught dressmaking, she taught actually how to thread up a sewing machine, very basic skills. But these were really a means to get people to talk to one another. One of her big projects was to go to northern Italy, to Trentino, and work with refugees and migrants, and to get them to tell their own story and to think about their futures through the vehicle of sewing. Now, when we think about COVID-19, this is the point at which I lost touch a little bit with Eliza's project. And I can only propose that this could be because hers was a very much a making project situated in local communities. There was a kind of very practical and physical presence to her work. But this was slightly different for Jake and Art School Ilkley. Again, him and his partner set this up because he believed that the arts in schools was diminishing. It was at an all-time low. And he had the idea that the values of access and undergraduate study needed to be defended. So him and his partner set up this amazing art school where older people, younger people could take part in intergenerational learning. Various workshops were set up, and then the work was put on online through social media for critical review. Now, when COVID happened, Art School Ilkley were determined to keep going, to be creative and to think about how they could continue their practice. And we can see here socially distanced arts class done outside in the courtyard, you know, really well thought through, and how the materials would be managed. And again, this, you know, thinking creatively enabled this project to go forward. Then we have another visual culture learning community, TCL, sorry. This is a group of 5 people who supported one another through exhibiting and basically worked with different kinds of audiences, but all saw themselves as practicing artists. And all of them were mature students and had, many of them, all but one, had an access background. So how did they respond to COVID? So again, through creativity, they did this online project called TCL Virtual Residency. And they sent each other materials through the post, materials for cyanotypes, handmade paper making. And challenged each other to make work with these materials and then post them online. And this was a way of getting people to see the work and to realise that COVID wasn't going to stop them being creative and to make them make their work visible. So just briefly, kind of looking at some of the common features of these learning communities. Many of them addressed a lack in formal education and sought to create dialogue through individual practices and creating exhibiting formats and informal events. They were all practitioner-led, all very responsive and flexible. Jake and Eliza sought to be really inclusive. However, Karen's VCLC was quite exclusive. It was really based on 5 people, and they sought to be inclusive with the audiences that they kind of worked with. We talked about being role models, for example, for other creative people. All of them in different ways were concerned with teaching creative skills, and really thought that opportunities for showing work and getting others to look and give critical feedback was really important. There's also this tenuous bridge between formal education. So when we look at the relationship to communities, Jake's was definitely situated in a community, but it was able to use social media to publicise the work. Eliza, very much again situated in a community, but didn't seem to be able to make that leap into the digital world. Karen, again, very much like Jake, it's almost like a combination of analog processes and digital processes to use online exhibiting. So some very tentative conclusions. The process of narrative inquiry is really effective when kind of connecting critical events of the past that appear to have a connection with subsequent events. It can be suggested that access students do have a potential for wider impact on their communities that goes beyond themselves and their families. And many of the projects did have a tenuous link with formal education, and this kind of, I suppose, tension between informal and formal education is perhaps a false dichotomy. For example, Jake, many of the people that he worked with got together an art portfolio that they then could go and apply to local institutions to get onto their courses. I would argue that Jake, Eliza and Karen give their time and skills not for financial gain, but because they felt it was the right thing to do. They believed in creative education and that people should have access to that. And this challenges some of the neoliberalist discourses around the individualistic motives of access students and access education. But it also, I think this work challenges the idea that visual culture learning communities are only meaningful to young people. I think mature artists and mature makers are very much interested in combining analog methods with digital technologies. The COVID-19 pandemic has been very challenging for arts organisations, as can be seen from the work of Tracy Brabin, who talks a lot about the impact of the pandemic on the jobs of the creative industries. But these small communities, these visual culture learning communities, are using their creativity to sustain themselves through COVID. Thank you very much for listening, everybody.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sam. We're slipping a bit more, so straight over to Martel. Thanks a lot.
Oh. Sorry about this. Oh. Can you see that? Hello?
Not yet.
Right, okay. 1 second.
Dio's got a backup version of the slides, so don't panic.
I just can't see it on the screen that I want to share. Thank you.
Well,
And if you could share, start the slideshow. Thank you very much. So, hello. I'd first like to pose you a question. If you could pop your answers into the Zoom group chat box. But next slide. Is what key moments, incidents, agents, and activities have informed your progression in your own education pathway? Whilst you ponder upon that, I will introduce myself and my research study. Next slide. This is me. I'm a progression manager at Leeds Arts that offers further education, undergraduate and postgraduate opportunities in the creative sector. The practitioner research study that I'm presenting is as a third year of a student PhD studentship, which has been supported by the ETF, the University of Sunderland Sunset team, and the university itself. Next slide. Next slide, thank you. Their defining moments is an interpretivist study. It utilizes Flanagan's critical instance technique to create a case study of 5 art students that I've identified as highly engaged. In this study, I've called them exemplar case studies. Their responses were gained by the storytelling prompts that you see here on the slide. The students were contributing a great deal back to the institution beyond the academic requirements of their course, be it as student ambassadors, working with the widening participation cohorts, as student union activists, that became elected to president, or winning awards, professional work placements, or commissions. My research aims are to identify the critical components, incidents, and influences that made a difference in their journeys to study the arts and what their recommendations to those following their path. Informed by these findings, through the knowledge gained through the student's voice, I hope to harness the knowledge and incorporate it into outreach design for much more disadvantaged cohorts in order to make a positive impact to their chosen education routes. Ultimately, my question is, what can the institution bring to the developing relationship with a prospective student to ensure their success in entry beyond level 3? Next slide, please. What the narratives revealed, however, was that they all experienced hurdles and boundaries that had the potential to hold them back from achieving their aspirations. What emerged were a series of setbacks, counter influences to their wishes. In their stories, they related encountering all these range of negative impacts. By definition of these experiences from the institution's perspective, they could be considered to be a particular group of students, whether by underrepresentation, such as a care leaver or a carer, estranged, as a protected characteristic group, by age, ethnicity, disability, by other factors that would label them, first in family, low socioeconomic, low participation area. Next slide. So, next slide, please. So I'll give you an insight into Bruce's story as a single thread within my research sample. From amongst my sample, he is a mature student in his 20s who as a family had returned to the UK. He found that on wanting to progress into a degree in illustration, he did not possess the required level 3 qualification, but he was in secure employment. He then went on to study access to HE in art and design in order to progress. Next slide. So from Bruce's narrative, the influence of his family trade and occupation is evident. He was developing his own creative practice as a child. He was hindered by his perception of worthiness and of value of a career in the arts. Next slide. What also came across was a very high level of digital literacy capabilities the access to the digital technologies he had and software, professional software, due to his parents' line of employment and within the home. Next slide. He was converting his creative practice from a hobby into the potential to become a career. Again, within these statements, there's a reference to his developing creative practice of being influenced by animations online in order to copy, spending hours drawing hands and eyes and characters. Next slide. So today we're considering aspiration and constraint in the post-COVID world and post-compulsory crisis. So this is, I consider, a very key point to consider within Bruce's story, is how the internet is a massive influence, how the digital technologies and access to digital technologies, digital poverty is causing a great divide. On to the next slide, please. Next slide. So he wanted to move. He was stuck into something that he said he had fallen into, but the biggest barriers that was presented was to move on from where he was, to make that jump, to make that step, and finance was stated as an issue as well. Next slide. At this point, he saw somebody that was doing, a friend of his that was doing what he wanted to do within the institution that he wanted to be at. But there was a moment of realization that he did not have the required qualifications. Next slide. And the key point here was that he raised that he required that stepping into the level 3 qualification in order to progress was to get time dedicated to what he wanted to do despite his career. So stepping on to the next slide. Thank you. So briefly, that was Bruce's story. His voice in my study and through the hermeneutical analysis is incorporated into a series of emergent themes. One of the storytelling prompts given for the interviews had asked them for recommendations that they would give to students following their path into the arts. This became a particularly rich area of interest to mine for themes and categories for the analysis. On this table on the left are the transcriptions of the recommendations, followed by the initial themes brought together into groups of categories. Next slide. For the analysis stage, I found it helped to work on a diagram to visualize relationships. The tiles could be moved and regrouped occurring between the emergent themes. This looks further for patterns of associations occurring across all the 5 respondents' narratives. The 12 tiles could be pulled together into 3 groups, which I've initially labeled as individual qualities of mind and character, personal investment, and access to resources. Next slide. So I've turned to Bernstein's 3 pedagogic rights in order to use this concept as a focusing device in the analysis. Bernstein describes the pedagogic rights as enhancement, inclusion, participation, and he considers these as tension points, whereas I refer to them as defining moments within my study. To quote Bernstein, is to cross the boundaries is to condense their pasts and to open up their possible futures. Of this, I interpret their experience, the influential encounters and contexts, their developing independence, becoming autonomous human beings, responsible for their own decisions and elected paths. Next slide. So my question becomes, what does the institution need to bring to the relationship in the entitlement of pedagogic rights described by Bernstein? There's an additional red tile that I brought into the diagram, which I've called facilitating pedagogies, to be able to access the interventions and the opportunities that the institution should provide. In terms of my own professional practice, This is the purpose and driver of outreach design and the WP curriculum that we bring to groups and individuals. It's a demonstration of the commitment of the institution to bring to enhance individuals' entitlement, to enable them to exercise their pedagogic rights in opening up their possible futures. As research study participants, point this out as being able to see role models, to have access, and by developing their own practice and networks, to develop their social and cultural capacities. In the next slide. So in this final stage, I've visualized this as one structure encompassing all 4 tiles that includes the contribution of the institution that all should expect. What is evident in their narratives is that my respondents have become influential and influencers themselves by their extracurricular activities within the institution. Next slide. The students in the recommendations are telling others to exercise their rights. And what is revealed are a series of factors, components, or ingredients. There is not a single solution. It is a heady cocktail of components, a fine balance of experiences, incidents, and influences that are operating. And next slide to finish. So just to close with a quote from one of the narratives as a gem of wisdom. So thank you for this opportunity to present. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And finally, it's time for Francis now. Yeah, and we've got Sarah who's ready to come after the symposium. Francis, are you good? Great, thanks.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you see my slides?
Yeah, lovely.
Brilliant. Okay. So following on from Sam and Martel, I am also looking at mature students, and in fact we work really close together, and Sam and Martel are brilliant colleagues that you know, we've kind of got an interlacing research interests. So in this conference presentation, I'm thinking about critical thinking, and I'm thinking about it in the COVID context. And as this project was started way beyond COVID, quite a lot of the thinking went on before, you know, putting the COVID into it. So I was thinking about critical thinking. I began a critical thinking club, and I work with mature students on a creative practice master's course. And this is like a story thinking about ethical issues and collaboration. So scholars such as Francis Shaw believe that adult learners are blocked and suppressed from thinking critically by society's expectations. Ken Brown calls this a critical thinking deficit in our education system, and Geppert et al., who write for the Tate, believe that creativity is essential to a global economy. So one of the issues that I have as an art lecturer is that art students are not that keen on writing. They love painting and drawing, but they need to have those critical skills to be able to write dissertations. So some art lecturers, Summerson and Hamano from Rhode Island Art School, think that critical making questions ideas and objects which serve to define a form of critical thinking, albeit with one's hands. So their argument is that when we make things, paint things, sculpt things, we are critical thinking, but with our hands. And Barrett and Bolt, who are also arts writers, say that critical arts research outcomes may be applied to develop more generative research pedagogies and methodologies beyond the discipline itself. That, you know, the kind of thinking that we do in art could have wider implications. So these two slides, which I'll kind of skip over quite quickly, are how I did my data analysis for this project. So I was looking particularly at Garrison et al., who works in the Open University of Canada, and they have created this blended learning framework for teaching and learning. So I've used this one together with Lippmann's framework as lenses to look at my data. Garrison et al., they have cognitive presence, social presence, and teaching presence. And within each of those presences, which interlink like a Venn diagram, the students and the lecturers gain experience and knowledge together. And this is Lippmann's ideas about thinking dimensions that happen in education. He says that there is critical thinking, creative thinking, and caring thinking. Again, these are interlinked and inseparable. So you can't have critical thinking without also being caring and creative, which for me as an arts practitioner, this is like it's like beautiful music. So I used these two frameworks to code and think about my data. I don't know if I've gone too far now. Yeah, I have. Sorry, I don't know how to go back. Does anybody know how to go back one? Oh, at previous, right, brilliant. Sorry. I'm going to talk to you about a critical incident vignette, which Macfarlane kind of put those three words together to talk about a story, basically, during my research. And in this story, some cultural appropriation happened. And in an art school, this can happen quite often. But for me, as a critical thinking somebody who thinks about critical thinking a lot, cultural appropriation can't be let go. Cultural appropriation is where we borrow ideas from other cultures without particularly referencing them or respecting them. So I'm talking about here a small project within the Critical Thinking Club. It was a 3-month project. And from my field notes, I talk about how we wanted to make a collaborative art project about a Vietnamese fictional character. The ethical issue of cultural appropriation was brought up very importantly by one of the participants, Keisha, who is anonymised. And I've put here, after all these weeks, nobody had thought of it. So this is like a massive omission on the part of everybody. And I write that I sought out advice from a colleague who had taught textiles in the Far East, and she advises that an ethical project is about respecting traditions, beliefs and contexts of that culture in creative work. So this was like a turning point in this project. So the Critical Thinking Club is like a loose collective of master's students who get together on a lunchtime and come up with creative ideas to think about issues, but also create creative outputs for possibly like a pop-up show or a zine or something like that. So participants had begun by using Lippmann's creative thinking, by developing a fictional Vietnamese character, working with process criteria of inquisitive and experimental creative responses, such as storyboards, sculptures, and film scripts. As the teaching presence, I encouraged the group to develop their ideas and creative projects, facilitating the group without overtly directing it. So critical thinking with questioning and self-correction was forming about the ethics of the project, seen in the seeking out of advice from a colleague. And participants were led by creative thinking that was generative and productive, not at first seeing the ethical issue. So participant Keisha points out a warning against cultural appropriation. And at that point, I stepped in with a much stronger leadership and teaching presence using guided Bildung. So Bildung is a German term that means self-awareness, learning, autonomy. So I'm kind of guiding them, but they're doing it themselves too. And And this was put together with scaffolding and supporting the group towards a new understanding of the ethical concerns behind this creative project. Another participant, Icona, realises that she should have thought about the ethics a lot sooner, and she calls this turning point a real critical moment. She says, we didn't take time to reflect, think or evaluate. And Icona's using the incident as a triggering event. Garrison calls that a triggering event, and makes an exploration of what happens in the art project. She works with process criteria of integrating to see, acknowledge and own the emission of ethics in the collaboration, which she formulates as the critical moment. Using Lippmann's creative caring thinking, she respects and values Vietnamese people and the creative ideas of the group. She reconciles what they've left out in a mindful and serious way. And together with Garrison's teaching presence, we were able to change the outcome of this project. We were allowed to recalibrate and learn from it, basically. So the findings of this project, first of all, that was teaching presence was really, really important. And the feedback from students was that my planning, delivery and structure helps creativity happen in a safe space and an ethical space, online or face-to-face. That the students need time to practice and to practice their critical thinking in a safe space. Again, you know, they build understanding by discussing things together, and ethical issues are very tricky and not with clear-cut answers. And also letting them fail. So letting them try something out and, you know, not get a great result is a fantastic way of learning. The second theme was connecting through story, which participants tell me was really, really important for them. That they use this club as a place to try out ideas, to be seen as human beings and to empathise with each other, which they found to be really, really affirming and part of their educational experience. Again, these kind of ideas fit very well onto face-to-face or online teaching and learning. So in summing up, participants are empowered and given creative confidence to think through ethical issues. They're connected through their stories and guided by teaching presence. And my thoughts are that by looking at the epistemology of thinking in a community of inquiry, we can see there's an engagement with wicked or unsolvable problems and ethical questioning. And an interesting outcome of this project is that the pilot of the Critical Thinking Club, because of its popularity, has been embedded into the curriculum. I think that's it. I've got some questions. You know, do you think critical thinking is a fad? Do you think the role of teaching presence is to engage students with tricky ethical issues? So I'm going to stop sharing now. Thanks for your attention.
That's lovely. Thanks very much, Frances.
Welcome.
I appreciate you keeping to time, although we're still a little behind. It's not your fault. That's the end of that symposium, which I think is really refreshing and different perspective to some of the other things that we've heard. We've now got one more presentation, however, all on our own. Sarah Bates-Savoy was the final presentation of the webinar. Over to you, Sarah. Are you good for all the? Are you good to share your screen?
I think so, yeah.
You're already at it. Okay. Over to you.
Thanks, Bill. Happy to be here with you today. So my presentation is on the reflective stances exhibited by Irish further education and training practitioners. I'm going to give you a quick introduction to myself. There was one question that came to my mind a lot when I've come to the end of this research, and it's a question that I'm going to pose to you to keep in your mind as well as I give this presentation. I know there won't be time for discussion, but you might be able to give some of your own responses into the chat box. I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to Margaret Archer's modes of reflexivity, and I'm going to give you examples of stances that I observed within research that I did myself with VET practitioners. So I work in Waterford Institute of Technology, which is a higher education institute in Ireland, and I also work in a further education centre as an adult tutor. So I'm in an interesting position where I get to lecture and research at higher education, but I'm still working in further education and training. I did doctoral research which examined the practitioner identities of those who work in VET, further education and training in Ireland, and practitioner identities were the identities held by the people working in the sector. I use the term practitioner because they refer to themselves differently. Some refer to themselves as teachers, tutors, facilitators, trainers. And the research, the small snippet of research that I'm going to present today is based on this research. There were 3 stages to the project. The first one was a consultation event. The second one was an online survey, which was based on themes that came up from the consultation event. And the third stage, which is where I'm pulling data from today, were narrative interviews. There were 12 narrative interviews done with VET practitioners where they told their stories about how they came to be a VET practitioner and how they personified their role as VET practitioners. What is interesting about the research or the approach I took was that the consultation event had a very broad theme, and then the themes that the people who attended that brought up themselves were what informed the questions on the survey. And then people could self-select at the end of the survey about whether they wanted to engage in a narrative interview. And 12 individuals participated in narrative interviews, 10 of which had self-selected during the online survey, and 2 of which were invited to make up particular cohorts. And the interviews were anything from 1.5 hours to 3 hours long. What came up for me now towards the end of this research is, can data be representative when research methods rely on participant self-selection? So I'm going to present data to you, but I keep asking myself, is it particular types of people who volunteer, A, to participate in an online survey, and that B then would volunteer to participate in narrative interviews and would share their story? And if it is particular types of people, do we really get to learn about the whole population if we are using self-selective research techniques? The conceptual lens that I'm using to look at my data is based on Margaret Archer's work around identity, structure and agency, and the particular piece I'm going to present today is pulling on her modes of reflexivity. And Archer would say that individuals can be active agents, and they're people who decide how they're going to respond and act in the reality they find themselves in. And the way they make these decisions is through internal dialogues they have with themselves. And she would have identified 4 different types of internal dialogue that we can engage with. And she describes this internal dialogue as the self as the internal speaker, and the self also as the internal listener. So there are 4 different types of reflexive modes or ways in which we engage with internal dialogue, according to Archer. Now, she would also say that there may be more than 4, and she would also say that we can engage with all different 4 types. However, most people have a preference or a mode of reflexivity that they use more often than other ways. So the first one is communicative, and these are people who will engage in internal dialogue, but then will also have to have external dialogue before they reach a decision. And they are often very concerned with family and friends and maintaining their social situation, and they will evade social constraints and enablements, as in they don't want things to change to try and hold on to the status quo. We then have the autonomous mode of reflexivity, and this type of reflexive is somebody who is quite confident to engage in their own internal dialogue, and they will make their own decisions without necessarily feeling that they need to run it by anybody else. They're also quite strategic. They often have work-orientated goals. That will be their priority, and they will act toward enablement or away from constraints in order to achieve those work objectives. Then we have the meta-reflexives, and these are people that I identify with. They often chase an ideal, so their ultimate concern will be in some way that a way that they want the world to be and that it isn't. And their type of internal dialogue is that they reflect upon their reflections, and they reflect upon why they and how they reflect. So they spend a lot of time in their head, and they are normally to a degree dissatisfied with themselves and with the reality they find themselves in, and they chase ideals. And they are sometimes subversive, as in, because they don't find the world the way they want it, they will ignore what's there and they will try and make it closer to their ideal. The last type is fractured. They didn't appear in my research, and these are people who their internal dialogue fails to give them any satisfaction. So they can't reach decision making, and they are very passive in the world, and the world happens to them rather than them taking any real engagement. So an example of this might be somebody with a very bad learning disability, or somebody who's experienced extreme trauma. And we can move in and out of these different modes, but we tend to have one favorite mode as such. So in my research, which was done with 12 people who work in further education and training, I found that there was a lot of meta-reflexives and a lot of autonomous reflexives, and less so communicative and no fractured. And what's interesting about this for COVID is that we have a lot of people who are able to work the system to get the best outcome, and are also able to reimagine the system. Examples of subversive stances, so people who were able to ignore what was the norm and make their own reality, was I had two of the older participants, Helen and Mary, had left school without taking any state exams, but they disregarded the limitations placed on them by society and also by their family. There would have been opinions that they should be stay-at-home mothers or work in shops, and they both went back to education and became adult educators. Maggie and Luke, in Ireland, we have what's called a teaching council, which is the only professional body available to further education and training practitioners. And they refuse to become part of the teaching council because it's a teaching council, and they feel that adult educators are tutors, facilitators, trainers, and instructors, and that they're meant to be an alternative to teachers. More examples: Peter, Lucy, Mark, and Paul, 4 other participants. They felt that the syllabus that was in place was not sufficient for what they wanted their learners to learn. So they would bring in real world content, which would not be abnormal. What is perhaps slightly more subversive is that they would vocally distance themselves from the official system to their students. An example of this is the bottom quote here. So this SLO, this specific learning outcome, is what your model needs you to do, what your module needs you to do, and I have to mark it accordingly, but it's rubbish. This practical skills is what I want you to learn. So these particular tutors were quite vocal about the inadequacy of the syllabus they found themselves teaching, and they brought in their own content into their classes. Another example was Philip, who is a course leader, and his approach was break the rules and hide the evidence. And every year he takes on 1 or 2 learners whom he doesn't record into a 1-year full-time program. And he takes in people that he knows can't complete it within the 1 year, but he feels would really benefit if they had to. So he takes them on, and him and his chosen group of tutors keep those people off the book, and they give them as much time as they need to complete the course. So there's those individual cases, they're not written about, they're not recorded. There were then examples of strategic stances. So these are the autonomous reflexives, and the 2 that stood out were Melanie and Fergus. Melanie was a nurse who was teaching in a further education centre, and she was the only one in the centre who came from a nursing background, and she felt quite isolated. So rather than sitting in that isolation, she set up a national network for teaching nurses. Fergus was quite unhappy with part-time further education and training being treated as less than full-time, and in particular practitioners working in part-time being paid less and being given poorer contracts to those working in full-time. He got involved with the teachers union, and he has managed to bring in what's called the BTI conversion, which just basically means that part-time tutors will get the same recognition as full-time tutors. That hasn't happened on the ground yet, but he was instrumental in making that happen. There was only one person who was, on the whole, a communicative reflexive, and her name was Bridget. She liked to keep the rules. She wanted to be seen as good, nice, and friendly by others. She did not self-select to be part of the research. She was my last interviewee, and several interviewees had dropped out, and we needed to find somebody who represented a particular program, and her principal asked her would she be involved. She was anxious from the beginning, and she was anxious afterward about being identified, which wasn't going to happen, but she was anxious about part of her story identifying her. None of the others had any issue about letting their stories go. And I suppose I come back to this question again: is there a particular type of person that self-selects to participate in research, in particular research interviews? And can we, as researchers, get a true sample of a population group through participant self-selection research methods? I want to go back to something that Fergus said in his interviews. This was the guy who went to the union and is actually making a change to the way our sector is going to deal with those working in the part-time vet sector. And while he was fighting this fight, he would meet people and they would ask him how is he getting on with the fight. And I just want to read his quotes here. "As soon as I get to talk to people in the same situation, they run. So other tutors wanted to know how the fight was going, but they would run away from the fight. They don't follow through with joining the teachers union. So they were willing to let him fight, but they didn't want to be part of it. There was a huge amount of people that haven't put their head above the parapet. They're terrified." So he spoke about how part-time tutors are afraid to challenge the system because they don't have secure contracts and their hours can be taken. So this just made me think that the people who self-selected to be part of my research were not necessarily the typical vet practitioners. And I suppose I would love to have had a chance to really throw that out to people and ask you, do you think self-selection is a lovely approach, but does it mean that we get a particular type of personality? And maybe at the next real BEAR conference, I get a chance to discuss that with people. I just want to acknowledge Margaret Archer as my key resource. And if anybody wants to follow up on anything that I've done, these are the places you'll find me. Thank you.
Okay, Sarah, thanks very much for bringing the event to a close. Colleagues, and I know some people have had to leave to go off and teach and are already under pressure to go and do other things. So let me be very brief in closing the event and saying, I think we've had a really interesting event with a hugely broad range of perspectives. And yet they complement each other really well. You know, we've moved from talking about, in quite a structural way, about contemporary modes of production and the way that they constrain vocational education in the UK and internationally. And we've moved towards some of the ways that both educators and students have aspired to create spaces in which they're able to move beyond the constraints that education, that society, and above all, the modes of production impose upon them. So thanks to everyone who's taken part. And now it's time for us to formally close the webinar. Those of you who've presented, I just want you to remain behind a little for one or two issues. Thanks for everybody though who signed up to the webinar. We hope you found it an interesting event. It's certainly not been dull. It's certainly not all been the same, that's for sure. And I hope we'll see you at future events for the SIG, for BEAR and particularly the post-compulsory SIG. Thanks very much.